So the great thing about the Colloquium series is, well, it's full. I think there might be 2 slots, but we'll have no problem filling those up. And it's non-traditional, so rather than just hearing people like get up and talk about their study for 45 minutes and then you ask questions, or maybe a little bit of that, but I think it's going to be much more interactive. So I always take the first one because nobody wants the first one. So this semester, we're bringing you a discussion of a project that we have that's an IMLS funded project that's related to natural disaster research in this region. And so I know that many of you are not from this area, so you may not appreciate how vulnerable this area is to natural disasters, but that's kind of where this project came from. So on the next slide, and then we have, let me introduce everybody before we go. So working the slides today, we have Zoe Lenarche. Curtis will be Curtis Tenney, Faye Jones, Denise Gomez, you know me. And we've all been working on this project in various capacities. So next slide, I think. So the first thing I want to talk about is the proposal. So I have a colleague at University of Texas who came to me to talk about doing a project where we gathered data about how public libraries interacted with the hurricane response in their communities a few years after the fact. And so if you think about when there were hurricanes that hit the Texas Panhandle, that would be like 3-4 years ago, like Hurricane Irma, if you can kind of, if you're a hurricane watcher, think back that far. And so at that point, a hurricane really hadn't hit this part of the country for a while. So we were looking back at hurricanes that had happened in South Florida a few years ago, and thinking that we would get some sort of recollection type data about how public libraries interacted in hurricanes. So, and it's a heap of people officially appointed on this side. Faye and I are co-PI in the Florida state side. Sharon Strover is our colleague at the School of Communication at University of Texas, and she's got a couple of people working with her. And I think actually Martin's now a postdoc, I think I feel it. But he's you can email him, Kara Palmer. So they'll find each other. So it's a whole bunch of people. So this is building on previous research that we've done at the Institute. And you may not know about this, but Chuck McClure, our own Chuck McClure, you can go to the next slide, who is, meet him while you can because he's retiring this semester, was 3 years in a row named the Hurricane Professional of the Year, the Hurricane Response Professional of the Year. I don't know if he gives out this award. He may have made up this award and given it to himself. I really don't know. He would not be here today to go on record one way or the other. But nonetheless, a lot of the work around the role of public libraries in hurricane response was done by the Information Institute around 2010. All the way through maybe 2013, maybe a little bit before that. So if you're ever researching this topic of public libraries and natural disasters, you're going to come up with stuff from the Information Institute again and again and again. And so that's a really nice foundation of research. And in fact, these are the areas that they have been studying, that they were studying at the time. So you can see it's the information management dimension too. But if you think about how a public library functions in the community, there's more than just, here, look at this information resource. It's a lot more deep integration into the community information hub, the organizing in the meeting space, the all sorts of like crazy services that they kind of improvise on demand, along providing shelter, all kinds of before, during, and after services to public libraries. And they were really the first group to document those in a hurricane context. Then there occurred all these years that hurricanes really were not hitting Florida at the rate that they were in kind of like the 2000s. See the next slide there. So, foolish us, we really thought that we were going to be doing some historical research. Then, as Sharon and I were writing this proposal and having these talks, New York Times published this very interesting map here, and I don't know if you can see this. We included this actually in the proposal, which I'm going to share with you here. In fact, why don't I do that now, so you guys can have a look at what the completed proposal actually looked like. You can just kind of take a look and pass around. I thought if you've not seen the IMLS proposal before, you might want to get an idea of what one looks like. If you think about, okay, so larger circles indicate costlier disasters. What's under this? Us, right? And then there's this pink stuff here. So we're pretty much like the epicenter of crappy weather impacts right here. So we thought, well, gosh, there's got to be something researchable there. And then if we look at how socially vulnerable these areas are, and knowing that the high social vulnerability is this sort of brick red color in the moderate here, if you look over here, we are pretty much a state full of moderate to high socially vulnerable populations to weather. So we put these two maps in the proposal, and I really think that it drove home to the reviewers. This is an area that is definitely in need of some study and how public libraries fit into that. So that's the proposal you have before you here. Because we were also working closely with a school communication, we have an ICT-focused research question. We really wanted to focus on small and rural libraries, and for us, since basically Florida State populates, I would say, at least a good half of the public librarians that are working, especially in small and rural libraries, are Florida State graduates, those who have degrees. It seemed natural for us to focus on places where we knew we could get good connections with our graduates. And then, of course, the institutional practices. Now, it's been a very interesting project as it's gone on to have communications researchers and LIS researchers working together. And we'll probably talk a little bit about that too, because we see the same situation different ways. And so that becomes very important. Okay. And then we have, let's talk about the project. So there's the project that got funded, and as with many grants, there's the project you do. And sometimes those aren't always the same project. And so if you go into the next slide, here's why. So as the proposal is under review, we have a problem that definitely makes studying hurricanes in public libraries all the more important because it's completely in our face. So we get funded, the University of Texas people are going to stick with their sort of historical perspective, and we said, you know what, this is happening now to us. We really have to make sure that we document this data because it's very ephemeral. One of the things that seems to happen is when people go through a big natural disaster and their community recovers, they push it out of their minds. So, I'm going to pass it over to Curtis and Zoe because they did most of the literature reviewing here. So take it, you guys.
Okay, so what do public librarians have to do with hurricanes? So our ground truth. So in many Florida counties, public librarians are tier 1, tier 2, or 3-tier first responders. So when we say responders, contractually obligated responders in many cases. So that does impact the response. So tier 1 is typically library directors in that sense. Tier 2 would primarily be library supervisors of various departments. And then 3 would be librarians and as well as library staff responding. And so this is school and public libraries are legally considered disaster shelters. So that became very, very powerful in particularly small communities where like sort of the first plan was to respond to public schools, and it was quickly realized that the public school infrastructure did not have the capacity to respond to that population. So then public libraries did become those shelters and really creating the space in order for those communities to shelter within.
And so right here is one of the ID badges, so they have the authorized entry so that they can get back into the town that they need to help out.
Notice this is by law, and this is unique in Florida. Public librarians are not usually considered by law to be tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 first responders in disaster situations.
So, we focused primarily on rural populations and libraries since we were looking at the Panhandle. That is the majority of what it is. We have also been looking at library services for older populations. This is kind of coming in a little bit more into play with some of our newer research, I would say. Then we also have been doing so much on looking into the before, the during, and after the storm. There's a lot of literature out there, but it's been quite powerful listening to the stories from these staff members, from these librarians. It's very difficult to sit through those. And then we are now starting to work on some more GIS-based projects, so getting more into the mapping, the infrastructure of the city.
Yeah, and grounding in the existing GIS research, I think that that's really powerful moving forward, considering this an emergency response context. So not only considering where we create or where we serve populations, where libraries are located, but in an emergency response setting, a lot of the recommendations and a lot of the existing recommendations do not necessarily take into account how various infrastructure, such as transportation recommendations, can change during a disaster. So for example, perhaps the closest library to you may not be easily accessible after a disaster. And really including so how transportation is affected in the disasters, looking at Hurricane Michael as a specific site, and then creating recommendations for how to include in procedures, in responses, how traveling to and from libraries, how that is changed, and making those recommendations. And not only necessarily populations existing within a community, but considering the aid that comes into a community, how various populations move into and out of an area during a disaster. So the method and the approach. So primarily using a grounded theory approach. So looking at the phenomena itself, looking at an exploratory research, conceptualize resilience as a process. Right? Resilience isn't necessarily, hey, this is how you resilience. Resilience certainly is a process. And as we spend time in site visits and talking with librarians, it's certainly the role of creating those services on demand, as well as solving those problems that you may not have considered beforehand. You can't necessarily prepare for every event. That definitely became apparent in this.
And that was also really apparent between the different locations. Some locations that you thought might have a better plan in place had nothing. Other locations that you might expect them to never even think about it had way more than you would ever imagine to have ready and set to go.
Yeah, and really using case studies, using varied public library sites in Florida and in Texas. I think using the two situations, the two settings and slightly varying populations, I think that has really informed our research. Another is perhaps the temporal aspect of this, I think has really enriched this research, looking at Hurricane Michael specifically as an event that is very much still affecting communities, still in recovery mode, libraries still responding to the lasting effects, as compared to Texas, where some of the interviews and some of the case studies are more historical in nature, so looking at some of the past hurricanes in that setting. So examining phases and framings of resilience. So also considering what we mean by resilience and what resilience not only means to us, but what resilience means to communities and resilience means to librarians. That has been very powerful. And then of course creating timelines and categories of responses to these disasters based upon these case studies and this research.
So we were focused on the Panhandle. We have met with people in Bay County and Calhoun, and did we meet with Gulf or are we planning to?
Nancy Brockman was.
Okay, so we did meet with one person in the Gulf County. We have been primarily meeting with librarians, the directors, the staff members, but we are also planning on branching out and meeting with kind of the people that worked with the library staff and librarians. So meeting with the county officials, the emergency operations centers, which became a lot really in play with some of the staff members at the library because they were also trained in that, so they basically got shifted over to the EOC. And as well as looking at some of the charitable organizations that were helping out in the aftermath of the storm.
So for participants and data to date, so we've spoken with 3 library directors, two using Collaborate sessions, one during a site visit. And in Bay County, we did have a site visit and a focus group. We had 10 librarian participants in this focus group. And we did learn from this that sometimes you do want to bring tissues to focus groups. And that's something with this research that definitely brought home to us is that emergency responders, information professionals, not only responding to these disasters, but also their lived experience during these disasters. That was a 106-page transcript. And it was really, really powerful in the sense that it was really just how did you respond, and really going around the room and everyone sharing their stories and their experiences in this was very powerful.
I just want to note though, the Bay County thing, we weren't actually there to collect data. We went in there to just introduce ourselves, and we left 6 hours later, and none of us had gone to the bathroom or had lunch, and so we were just madly recording and writing down everything they said.
Yeah, it was one of those instances where most of them had not told their story yet. And so having that opportunity, it just kind of opened the floodgates for them.
And with the Calhoun County site visit, we met with folks throughout the day and toured various sites in Calhoun County, and I did include later in the presentation some photos from that visit, so you'll be able to see a little bit of the and then services and needs data from Florida State Libraries. So the folks from the Florida State Library they were kind enough to share their hurricane response data from Michael in 2018, Irma in 2017, and Matthew in 2016, and that was primarily responses from public libraries, just expressing their needs during that time, as well as the services that they provided.
So, well, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead. I'll finish after this.
Okay, so while we were collecting our data, we kind of used 2 different methods. We had our phones out and we were recording them as they were speaking, or for our couple of sessions, we had the Blackboard Collaborate session, so that was nice because that recorded as we were doing the discussion. I wish I would have found it earlier for a very long session, but I did find an app, it's called the Otter app, and it basically transcribes as you record. So as you're recording it, you'll see text flowing through the screen. Obviously, it is not perfect. But it is adaptable, so the longer it listens to certain voices, the more apt it is to detect who's speaking and what they're saying, adapt to their different dialects, their different accents. I found out it is not very great for Southern accents, but for the most part, it was a really great help.
No, go ahead, I see that you have other things.
Just, this is one of the Collaborate video sessions that we recorded, so.
Well, yeah, that's the one, that's why I just. Okay, so, I'm Faye Jones, and, for data collection, as they mentioned, qualitative study, grounded, right? So basically what we're trying to do is induce information from the participants and the surveys and the, focus groups and information that we, collect, so that hopefully that information can turn into some themes or other theory, et cetera, so grounded theory. Now, again, we went thinking, okay, we're gonna conduct these interviews, but as Marcia indicated, we went to, Bay, and what we thought would be an interview with one person, and she invited her entire staff, and we were there with tissues and everything else, collecting the data as they're telling their stories, and really was that impactful. And so you really have to try to still remain objective, right, as you're getting all of this information. So as we did that, I wanted to share kind of how this process works. If you guys can get to that, the Google Doc.
The tab is up.
There we go, great. And a few things as we have some volume.
We have some volume there.
Marcia made a comment that I had really needed to work on my earphones because they were very.
If ever there was an advertisement for AirPods, I
know. So anyway, but again, this was just the initial recording so that we could get our stuff, straight. So again, making sure that we have our training and Marcia making fun of me as we're doing all of these pilot testing of our how we're going to collect the data and how we're going to record the information and whether everything's working. You can't assume that everyone knows what they're doing and that everyone coming on has access to the same things that you need. Had an interview yesterday, they had neither audio nor did they have video. They actually had to go home because the college had less technology than they did at their home. Okay, so that's a whole other issue altogether.
We'll present about that next semester.
Yes, don't assume that everyone knows, but again, be flexible as it relates to that. So that information then gets transcribed. So can you talk a little bit about that process and how we go from a YouTube, the recording to the transcription?
So
And there's the nice.
it comes down to patience and just setting aside time where the only thing you're going to focus on is the audio and making sure that you are truly 100% focused on it. What I wound up doing was InVivo has a new little transcription thing and you can do like a free 10 minutes. So I just made 1 million accounts and kept getting those free ones. And so that gave me a base text for everything. And then I went through again and I had the audio playing and I just corrected all of the text as it was going through the audio or the videos. It was a lot of rewinding, playing again, rewinding, playing again, me trying to figure out what that mumbled sound was and what words it actually was. There's some parts where I just had to insert can't understand, don't know what this was saying, and it's just, you gotta be, accept that it's going to be as accurate as you possibly can, but it's not going to be perfect.
Okay, so once we transcribed the information came the lovely Denise. And basically you'll see here how she's reviewing the transcripts for relevance to our research questions, right? So Denise is scanning the transcripts, and maybe Denise, can you talk a little bit about, how you did that and what you were doing and the process?
So I was going through, and what I had is I had like a little cheat sheet of my research questions next to me so that I could kind of see what would be combined with what they were trying to say and trying to figure out thematically how that works. And so I would go back and forth between those questions, and it actually changed a couple of times. Like I would go back and I would reread it and I'm like, okay, this actually has 2 different parts and I have to really split this up into Q1 and Q2. Maybe Q2 is not the best spot for this, so I would go through, and it really took a rereading like a couple of times as you went through all the transcripts and trying to, a lot of it was very emotional. It was very, like it kind of hits you emotionally, so you really have to come from a place of, again, being objective to the material and trying to really figure out, okay, where does this fit? Are we really talking about resiliency here? Are we talking about the process that we're doing before and leading in? Are we talking about the process of actually being in the hurricane during the disaster and approaching it from that end? So I think there's just so much to unpack when you're going through the transcripts. And this was initially how I started, and once I finished this, I actually created a document where I went through and I put together all my Q1 responses, all my Q2 responses, all my Q3 responses, just so that I could see one after the other and really kind of get a feel for what thematically was happening.
I wanted to kind of have you explain that because that's a little bit different from another process that we're also using for, that's with our folks in Texas, right? They've got a bunch of codes that they've given us where we're actually taking the transcripts and saying, we've got evidence of the use of fax machines, and we've got evidence of the use of, other types of.
I had a lot of communication-based codes because they're the communication people, whereas, so a lot of theirs was more along just stuff that applies to their department.
Right, like social media, use of Facebook and use of Instagram, and so actually going in and looking for specific instances of those things. That's when you're using codebook versus when you're going straight inductive and trying to generate some themes. So again, we're actually doing both here in Florida and trying to also see what we can find, some of those things that parallel align, and also some of those outliers, things that they might not have seen, by using the data.
And I will say though, that this part that Denise was doing was really important too, because one thing you don't wanna do is have 20 hours of transcripts and then find out that you have absolutely no data pertaining to research question 3. So, keeping in mind those research questions are not just the contract you make with the reader in a paper, but they're also the contract you make with the funder of the study, that you say you're gonna answer these 3 research questions, so we needed to go through and kind of get a high level read on how we were doing toward answering each one of those research questions, even if the point of this was not to answer the research question at the time.
And Marcia is making a valid point, because as we were going through, I think it was question 3 that we didn't have much on, and we said, oh crap, we're supposed to interview some folks from the outside. So not just the director, not just the staff, but also those in the community and maybe folks from emergency management, et cetera. So that's the next round of interviews that we're doing now, because we found that we're missing a little bit on one of the research questions. So but we're getting there, we're almost there. So again, wanted to share that process. Any questions for me? Let me see here.
We go
Wanted
into
to
it.
see. Did you want to talk a little about this, and we can keep
Yeah, we
going
can
with that?
keep going.
Okay.
So our Calhoun site visit was probably the most unique visit I think any of us have ever been on. As you can see from this picture, some of their libraries are no bigger than basically one room. And the main library is,
We're inside this is Marcia, right?
Yes, yeah,
yeah,
that's
that's Massipan, that's their generator, so
That's the main library.
That's their main library, yeah.
the main library was really updated, kind of brand new, fully designed. And then they also had Mossy Pond, which is a big cement basically building, walls 10 feet deep into the ground, and it looks like you're in the set of a horror story kind of. But it acted as a shelter for the county. So it had all of the safety precautions in order to keep you safe during a storm. So they've recently placed got a generator for the building, which is that bottom picture there, so that they could have some running everything, basically a little bit of everything during and after the storm. Upstairs in that building, they have, it's kind of like almost like an attic where they had shelves and shelves of food. Obviously at the moment now, since the storm is past, they didn't have that much stockpiled, but they had all of the equipment they needed to house the people that were coming to stay there at the shelter. You wanna talk about it a little bit?
What I would add at Mossy Pond, so in thinking about your entire community and the specific community that you're serving, in order, providing the sleeping arrangements and the various materials available, they did make a point to have various sections, so equipment for differently abled folks to use the various sleeping and creating those arrangements. I included the first photo. I know this is a little hard to read, but I included this one because of the main library. This says Hurricane Michael Disaster Recovery, and this lists all of the services that are housed in this library. So assistance with perhaps if you, for food insecurity assistance. And a lot of this is out of various responses to, well, go to your public library for assistance. And this library has really responded by creating offices within this library to really the community members that come in to assist these folks?
So Calhoun County is very rural, they have a lot of high-need people. So the county got rid of a lot of the buildings that would assist people, so the library now houses like the SNAP food services. They have, what else? I don't remember. They had,
Yeah, so there was also the assistance with like signing up for like one everything in the office they assisted primarily with like FEMA response. And then as well as applying for like various medical assistance.
So I was trying to think of, and they had a huge computer lab in there and everything. And back onto the Mossy Pond with the sleeping arrangement, they actually split the building into two sides. They had families on one side and those without families on the other side of the building.
So at Mossy Pond, they sheltered 144 people for 2 weeks. And they have a kitchen in there and they were cooking 3 meals a day for these people. They had a trailer that came that had showers. And in fact, there's probably still, what people in that community learned is that there are more amenities in that library than there is in many of their homes. Because there are quite a few people there who don't have running water nearby. It's a very high poverty area. And so people really learned a lot about the library there. But the important thing here, and Michaela, I see your question, now I'll get to you, is that this person right here, next level leadership. So she cut a deal with the county commissioners, in which there are 6. Now Calhoun County, you saw where it was in the map, it's a landlocked county, this is not a coastal county. People have to like have a reason to go to Calhoun County and they're not going there for vacation, let me tell you. They might be going there to, avoid the law or whatever, but they're not going there for vacation. She cut 6 separate deals with the county commissioners that she would create a public library in whatever fashion they needed. So the Mossy Pond Library, that county commissioner or that corner of the county said, well, you gotta build it as a shelter. And it is, like Zoe said, a cement bunker. A cement bunker, and it's made of, 5 sheets of concrete that are, that go 20 feet under the ground, and it's incredible. It's kind of a very interesting place. And then, and the librarians there aren't just first responders by contraction, by contract. This one, you can see top of her head there, she's a volunteer fire person. So she's, yes, in the volunteer fire department. So this one was actually a building where they were storing shovels and rakes. And the county commissioner said, well, fine, if you want a public library here, do something with this building. So, this lady was just like, okay, we will. And so now this teeny tiny landlocked county, it's not teeny tiny, but relatively small landlocked county, with 17,000 people in it, has 6 public library locations. So I think she's just an exemplar in leadership. But when they told us that they sheltered 144 people for 2 weeks and were cooking them 3 meals a day, the librarians were, I just thought, this is something that other people need to hear about.
But I was even more impressed, Marcia, when they told us that they barbecue. And I said, well, what are you barbecuing? They said, we brought our deer meat, and we brought in our cattle meat, and we just, everything in the freezers, and la-di-da-di everybody. And I was like, what?
And you can't even get self-service there.
It was pretty impressive.
Word of mouth is powerful.
It was impressive. Understanding that they are rural and they have cattle and agriculture and all those things. So the things that we have to go to the store to buy, they just have in their freezer.
And there's still
Impressive.
food there because the librarian there will still cook food for any children that are hungry, and she'll just prepare them a meal.
So it was really quite an educative experience for the community.
I was actually curious, where exactly is Mossy Pond?
Where is Mossy Pond? So we came there from Bluntstown, and Rita, this is Rita right here, said to us, I need to take you there because you'll never find it because because there's no satellite or cell, so you couldn't really use GPS. So you leave Bluntstown, it's near Alta.
Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, people do go to Elmwood County for the nature. Let me just correct that portion a little bit, because of the Appalachian.
But they don't go there to go to the beach, was my point.
No, no, it's because of the river.
Sure, yes, there are people who hike, I'm sorry, asterisk, yes, okay. But yeah, so this is, people who go there and stay there, like, really have an intention to be there.
So our interview protocol, our interview protocol is created for the project with 48 interview questions for the project total. So for each of our interviews, of course, that is not to be respectful of everyone's time. We cannot ask 48 questions of every person. So for each interview, we select from this protocol the specific set of questions for each interview. Would it be helpful to pull out the protocol?
Sure, just to give people a sense of the kinds of questions that we're asking. Might wanna zoom in a little bit, you can see.
And for our Bay County visit, we did not have to really even look at this. Once they started talking, they basically covered everything
Yeah,
on
and
our
then
list.
after we analyzed the transcripts, they really hit all of the major questions that. So, in the beginning, general information, basic information, so telling us a little bit about their work and who they are, how long they've been in that position, how long that they've been in this community, as well as the community level activities that they're engaged with. Questions related to general disaster relief and resilience. And this really helps to get that information. So as far as preparations before, as far as emergency services, what roles, as far as additional resources, so getting at that before, during, and after. Next set of questions relate to the role of information community technologies and disaster relief, as well as resilience and institutional learning, communications with other stakeholders, implications for libraries, and then perceptions about the role of libraries. So what do you think your public library is doing well in disaster relief? Additional questions. How do you library? And we went over the major question sets. So this is the questions guided us to learn more about libraries and disaster relief and resilience questions. To learn more about the roles of the ICT and disaster relief. Use of social media, use of library webpage. One thing that we learned about social media is that, particularly when we were in the Mossy Pond area in Calhoun, is that perhaps populations do not use social media, so really grassroots communication was really the star of getting information out in those particular communities. To learn more about resilience and institutional learning. So the institutional learning is one important part of this research. So after this experience, how have preparations changed in making those recommendations? Denise did an excellent job while talking about some of the data analysis, thematic analysis. In addition, we have used NVivo to do some of the data analysis. And we talked, Dr. Jones talked about the code book earlier. So we created a code book with the University of Texas. We used Deduce, which worked very well to collaboratively work with a researcher from the University of Texas. So I'll pull up the code book so we can get a look at it. This is very much a collaborative and very much a process in creating a code book. So you can see that this is the coding scheme. So the image that I have here is from Deduce. These are all of the parent codes, and then each one drops down into the child codes. And you can see in our code book that it really is a process. So working here and then working at University of Texas, so I would drop comments in to say I added librarian role here to code unique disaster services. Martin would respond to be like, this makes sense. So really coding the interviews and then meeting together to see how well our codes match, how well they don't match, and perhaps why that's the case. Yeah, so that was an experience. But I think that it really helped looking at the different perspectives to sort of question like, well, why did I code it this way? Why did you code it that way? And coming to that intercoder reliability on the codes and the transcripts.
And you can see it's a lot to look at while you're coding.
It is a lot to look at
So
while
you have
you're
to really pay attention to the broader categories in order to find the narrower ones.
Yeah, and one technique that we found helpful is doing the initial codings of the interviews is memoing. Deduce has an excellent interface for inserting memos into a code, so I found it helpful to first go through as I coded to create like memos all to the side, and then I would be able to see Martin's memos, and then we'd be able to see like each other's rationale since we are at two different locations. That was really helpful in understanding each other's perspective and coming together as we discussed our codes. Preliminary findings.
Yeah, so these are some of the themes that we found when we were going through the transcripts. So we're looking for is like specifically, what does it have to do with that research, the research questions that we were looking at, but then what themes kept coming into play as we were looking around it. And what we found was that library workers, we were looking at library workers as emergency social service and information providers. So they were having to do a lot where it comes to dealing with the social services and being first responders for the community coming in and needing information on whether it was jobs, food, communications, any of those kind of things. So we were seeing that meeting places around the counties had disappeared because they were no longer viable structures. So now the library was being used as a central hub for meeting space. And that went on for more than a year after they were still working as meeting places. We found that the library was providing technological communications in that one, their power kind of came on before others in the community, and then the faxing services that were needed through FEMA, that was a big thing because FEMA was only taking faxes, not online responses. Then they were setting up Wi-Fi hotspots. Verizon towers completely came down during that. So there was, and since the city was mainly using, the county was mainly using Verizon for their services, now all of a sudden they had to have other phone companies come in and kind of set up Wi-Fi hotspots, not only for them, but for the community at large. We found that library workers were archiving the disasters as they were happening and after, when they were coming back in and just kind of seeing everything. They were picking up a camera and taking pictures as they went along so that they could kind of preserve that and kind of use that within their archival process. And then they were assisting others by having special sessions on how to save your own or preserve your own photos and archival kind of information so that you can keep track of that. And they also started a storytelling project showing that resiliency through storytelling, trying to help the kids and the adults deal with this disaster through that storytelling method of putting together their own kind of story to it. And then we saw that the library resources and services were being used just as a relief from the storm stress. Let me check out a book, let me get a DVD for my portable DVD player, let me anything I can do to kind of like separate myself from the day-to-day of I have no power, there's nothing I can do here, I'm always picking up stuff, and so it was kind of like
Screaming kids at home.
yes, exactly. So it was kind of like a relief from that situation, so people were turning to them because of that.
So talking about balancing roles, so we selected this code from the community and social relations librarian. My role was so different. I did a little bit of the social media of the library while I was gone, but I was also balancing two jobs. So particularly in Bay County, when we were talking to the folks there, so really understanding how roles, like what are the expectations for what is going to happen after a disaster. As I said earlier, of course you can't plan for everything, but many of them were assigned to various roles, working with the volunteer reception center, working with the library, and moving the volunteer reception center. Creating it.
They were for the volunteer reception center, they were basically told, you're making one of these, and that was it. So they had to completely figure out what the volunteer reception center was supposed to be, what it had to do, and what their community needed.
Yeah, and introducing the disaster response role is also tracking and reporting the librarian's work time during this time. That's important because they have to, oftentimes for the FEMA reimbursements and for insurance purposes and for workflow, being contractually obligated responders during that time, tracking all of that information is quite an added work during that time.
So the meeting spaces were a really important part of this.
We have our quote, we get called almost every day at reference to try and find a place for people. Buildings were torn apart, there's people who needed to get together, but they didn't know where they could get together. So a lot of the public library space in Bay County during this time was taken up. It was used by organizations, they had FEMA house there, they had just all of their space used up, and a lot of the library stuff just had to get set aside during this time. It was more focused on the recovery, and the invisible librarian work became kind of their little back job kind of stuff, where they had to cancel room reservations, and it was, I had to go into the fees and stuff.
Yeah, and this, I mean, in addition to the meeting rooms, I mean, finding physical places for people to be, assisting with the community, to be like, well, there's some condos out here that they're sheltering people in, trying to figure out people preferences to be like where to place people as well.
And even if it's just like in the middle of wherever is the spot.
And job boards,
Oh, the job board was a big thing because there's a lot of jobs that were opening up during this time, but no way to do them online. The library made a job board where they just printed out and posted all of the job openings at the time, and they kept us updated daily. So because everything was changing, new things were coming up every day, so it was just constantly updating and changing that board.
Keep in mind that the hurricane took down the Verizon towers, so there was very, very, very limited cell service. So that's why all of these backup, sort of more face-to-face communication styles, and even getting word out to the community via Facebook, it would have to be off of somebody's personal account.
The signs on street signs, those big light up street signs, information was being shared on those.
Did you find the FEMA system impacted with FEMA not having a lot of forms online and then people not having access online? Did that come up a lot?
It was basically having to learn outdated technology all over again, and
to connect it.
yep,
Yes.
and
Some
find
of
them
them
at
had to
all.
actually turn on faxes.
Find where the fax machines were, if there were any left in the county, kind of thing.
Because in the county, the library was really the only institution with access to meet that need. Many of the more conventional places that you may go to that, I mean, how often do you fax? But many of the commercial spaces, of course, were not open. So really the library is one of the few places that you could do that. And many of the community members coming to fulfill their needs and to filing these requests that may not like have the technical skills to do that, so not only providing access, but providing guidance and linking those needs. So the various roles of the librarians, particularly in Bay County, so they're providing information and providing discussion, and many of these are, of course, not just because of the response, or not just disaster and a vacuum, but many conversations that begin before and continued after, particularly climate justice information, working with various outreach information, working with children in the community who, while they live so close to the beach, have never been to that beach. Of course, legal information, just so many. It's the legal librarian talking about wishing they had more computers available with the requests that they were getting for various landlords, water rights, all of these various questions that very uniquely began to emerge during the various disasters that affected the community and the folks who lived there, as well as health information, elder care, many of the outreach library works beforehand with many of the elder cares and much of their wellness from their perception of the effect of the hurricane and everything that came after that, as well as the disaster recovery information, the FEMA waiving the fines that we spoke about earlier. Is there anything that you would add?
I just found it so interesting that there was two dimensions to this that I think we went in totally not expecting to hear about, but we're so fascinated. And that is really understanding how socioeconomic differences play into the ways various communities are impacted by the hurricane. So Panama City and Panama City Beach are a great example because there's this bridge that divides them. And the poor people live on one side and the rich people live on the other side. And so the poor people were the ones impacted. The rich people were like, why are all these poor people in our library branch clogging up our space? And then the librarians would be like, well, hurricane? And they'd be like, well, that happened 2 weeks ago. So, you know, it's just this whole like climate justice thing that resources kind of get apportioned in ways that may not necessarily be fair. And one of the reasons that the Panama City Beach is not normally impacted, but because of the temperature of the Gulf and the slight increase in the water, things are hitting there that never used to hit there because it's this big sandbar that used to prevent all of that. So now it's like headed straight for the poor folks in Panama City, and it was very interesting to hear about. The second thing that I think we weren't quite sure why we were talking to the legal librarian, but then she like was the star of the show. Like she totally blew our minds. So what started out as landlord-tenant issues, landlords wondering how they could use this opportunity for their apartment buildings that are damaged to get the tenants out that they wanted to get out all along and get the insurance money to improve their apartments. So there was some of that going on. Tenants, how can I, you know, I lived in this apartment, all my stuff is gone, like what do I do? And so that piece of it, but quitclaim. I've been going to vacation in Grandpa's house now for 30 years. Grandpa died, so I just keep coming, but Grandpa still owns the house and he's dead, and I can't file for insurance because he still owns the house. What do we do in that situation? So we heard a lot about that, and the squatters' rights were something that were coming at the end, like, well, you know, I'm fixing this house up, and so the way I see it, it's mine. And like, what do you do in that situation? So these were really interesting dimensions that I think we went in, and now this is what's happening in Bay County, which is a little bit of a different situation than what's happening in Calhoun County, but those were dimensions that I don't think have been documented in the literature anywhere.
But not just even in the weeds, we looked at things from the upper level of the directors and where are they getting their information from? Who's talking to them? What information are they getting or not getting? And how, do they have a policy in place? It's really interesting. Some of those locations we really thought would have a policy in place. Something that would, an operating procedure, if you will, on how they would handle things. Some didn't even have one. And really they say, well, we're getting to do this, or we're gonna update it, but guess what, sometimes they'd be fired or not be there or leave or retire, and then the next person wouldn't have something to kind of, you know, capture that. So again, we're seeing instances where we went to one place, had policies, operations this big, others, you know, something to nothing. So again, some of those issues, or the role of the librarian and the director in being a part of the emergency operations centers. We found some that they are lucrative, you know, they're always there impacting, but then we found others that are not even invited to the table. So again, why that difference between some counties and, you know, the director being a part of the EOC and then some of them not being. So again, some other interesting findings as it relates to the upper level, you know, top management.
So this is from our discussion with the children's librarian at Bay County. She had a quote, and I think it was probably the most impactful quote from our trip, and it was one of the little boys said, oh, the library's broke too. And it was how these kids kind of made the analogy between seeing their homes destroyed and seeing that the library has leaks. The library building is not in perfect shape right now. But this was a little display they made for the kids, and the children's librarian was a little scared at putting this like right in on display for the children to see. She thought it would be like, wasn't sure how they would create it, but it was really important for the kids to see that even after the hurricane, the sun will come out. There's still some light at the end of this tunnel, and it's really important just to show the kids there is information that you can read about, make those connections, kind of begin to deal with what you just went through and see that there's books out there, there's something, some other person has gone through the same thing before.
Your studies.
Yeah, Yeah, so some of the findings, as we're working with these findings, so one aspect that definitely emerged from this data, from some of the quotes that I'm sure that you've seen, touch a little bit on this theme. So addressing mental health in the community disaster recovery. So according to State Library of Florida, many librarians did report suffering from compassion fatigue. That was one of the first things when I met with some of the folks at the State Florida Library, was talking about and identifying their needs, discussing compassion fatigue, reliving those stories, folks expressing the stories that they experienced during the hurricane, and then the librarian perhaps thinking, wow, I thought I had it bad, but I don't have it that bad. And then of course, just as the recovery really extended, we're still in recovery over a year later, continuing with these stories. Many librarians identified the need for services of a counselor or a therapist. So supporters needing support. So we survived only because we helped each other. Nothing prepares you to be one of the storm people. Things are not the same, and they will never be again in my lifetime. I have survivor's guilt. I try to cry only at home. Hurricane Michael not only caused physical damage, it has left scars on the hearts and minds of survivors, and that's from WFSU. So that is certainly throughout talking with public librarians and the various responders in these areas. So supporting and needing support. So while they do provide the support to the community members that come into the library and working throughout it, so how do we provide support for librarians?
And like I mentioned earlier, for a lot of them, when we went to meet with them, it was the first time they told their story. The coworkers did not know what their other coworkers went through because they were just keeping it bottled in, because they had to listen to it daily from people in their community.
So, yeah, Denise talked earlier about the storytelling component. So this, so many of the public libraries participated in these storm stories workshops. So many community members would come to these story writing workshops. So this is Buddy's story. This is from an outreach librarian that just telling our stories is huge. And of course, as many of them began to tell their stories, as Zoe said, perhaps many of them hadn't retold necessarily their own experiences, and as they're responding to these questions, really began to process some of the experiences that they've gone through themselves. So the Storm Stories workshop, it's community, it's not just libraries, it's very community led. The libraries are participating in this. Many community members worked on the stories in their libraries. Buddy's story is about the Telepo honey, which is, so that's created with the Telepo trees found in the Apalachicola River Basin. So Buddy had all of his business licenses, everything done. October 9th, his inspection was planned. You know what happened on October 10th? Yeah. So these bees, he kept these bees alive, feeding them often sugar water. After he emerged from his home, he was surprised to find that the bees were still alive, but of course near starvation because of the destruction to the trees and the very, no source of food for these bees. So he engaged in the Storm Story workshop to create this book, and is now selling the Telepo honey as the the treats are beginning to survive.
Anybody had the Tupelo honey? It's
Tupelo honey, but yeah.
Tupelo. Okay, so, but it's really good.
It is, and it's like different.
Yes.
If you've had it, you know it. It's delicious.
And then of course the historical preservation. Because after the disaster, history was made that day in more than ways than one. People coming in asking me is this the street using that historical information to really look at the documentation of that area before and after Hurricane Michael?
So as you can tell, we have a load of data. I mean, hours and hours of transcripts. This is just the stuff that we're pulling off the top. And there's way more there. So for the next steps, and we're at 11:58, so I want to kind of wind this up for us. We have some follow-up and additional site visits to do, some interviews with these external collaborators, and then we've got a couple of pending collaborative research proposals. So you go to the next one. The first one we're doing with the College of Engineering, picking up on what Kurtz was talking about earlier about the GIS work, about site location of libraries, because it may be, if you are, for example, located in this corner of Calhoun County, your nearest public library might be here, well, actually here, but there might be one even closer to you in the next county over. And you may not be eligible for those services. So just sort of some awareness around that. That's the kind of thing that this is looking at. And seeing how it informs disaster plans, as Faye was talking about too, because we found those to be all over the place. Because when the disaster is over, people don't want to think about it anymore, much less go and write policies about it. And the next one. And this is the one also Curtis was talking about relating to solar, which is something that we have pending with the Center for Translational Behavioral Science and College of Medicine here at Florida State to actually find ways to get librarians that support that they need in the process of supporting other people. So you can go to the next slide there. And so, Chris, you probably know more about solar than I do, so.
Yeah, so solar is a 5-session intervention program. So this has never been used it's never been used in the context of librarians, and it's primarily been used in communities such as faith leaders. So this is a really excellent opportunity to train librarians to become trainers themselves for this program. So you can see here, these are all the tenets of the solar program. So this is not psych work itself, it's more like first response to trauma in an event. So
Before they would be determined to have PTSD. So it's working before that all hits and starts affecting them more.
And so we have the excellent opportunity of having spoken with the librarians to consider potential participants to become coaches. And once coaches are trained, coaches are then able to train others as well. And so that would be supporting after trauma, healthy living, managing strong emotions, getting back into life, coming to terms with the disaster, managing worry and rumination, and maintaining healthy relationships are really the tenets of this. So that's really the training really helps in response to all these folks coming in, retelling their stories, sharing their experiences with trauma, and the training really helps support librarians in engaging in these conversations and maintaining these tenets.
And this is community-led, it's not led by health professionals, it is community-based to try and develop those relationships a bit better, have people that you are comfortable with working with you and just kind of developing those conversations.
All right, we threw a whole bunch at you. We're still making sense of it ourselves. This project ends at the end of 2020, so we gotta get the let out, but it's just been fantastic, full of surprises, moments. It's been very big, so watch this space. If you have any questions, you can of course tap any of these people here in the room. MSI student Denise Gomez, you know Curtis and Zoe and Faye. So thanks very much, and if you have any questions, feel free to hang around and ask me.